Welcome to the Try to Hit the Pool podcast, where we explore masculinity from all angles. I'm here with Ray Alex Williams. We're going to speak about manhood, AGP, detransitioning, and just a little bit of his personal story and how he has come to terms with his manhood and what steps he's taking to be a better man. So welcome to the show. I wanted to start with just a little bit about yourself and what's kind of led you to here.
Yeah, thanks, Sasha. I'm really excited to talk to you today about these topics. I think they're really important, and I think this is an important project that you're engaged in. And I'll try and briefly summarize my life story that brought me here. So, I consider myself to have the condition of autogynephilia. That manifested as a syndrome in young age. I developed a fixation on nylons and hosiery as like a young boy prior to puberty, and then during puberty, and it kind of accelerated and intensified and took on a more erotic nature, and going into high school and into my 20s, I got exposure to transgender pornography, hentai futanari, and stuff like that, and I also was engaged in a lot of fetishistic cross-dressing, so. Basically dressing up, getting aroused in women's clothing, and usually lingerie and stuff like this, and watching transgender pornography, and that cross-dressing identity was basically, what I was fine with that, and I was dating women, and I got married in my mid-20s, and so that's kind of suppressed it for a long time because I kind of contextualized it in the bedroom. It was just this private thing I did as a kink, it's just a fetish, which is a common refrain is, trans-identified males are always am I trans or just a fetish? Well, for most of my life, up until I was 20 years old, it was just a fetish. Mm-hmm. And then, my first wife, she ended up leaving me. I won't go into the story there, but, there was some infidelity, and probably my, insuitability as a husband at the time for a variety of reasons, mental health issues and my cross-dressing and stuff like this, even though I tried to keep it in the bedroom. And but long story short, when she divorced me, besides being really upset and sad, one of the first things I thought...
Did you leave your wife or did she leave you? Which was the...
She left me. She left me.
I'm sorry to say that.
I discovered, that she was having an affair, and then after that, I stuck with her, but we opened up the relationship, so we had an open marriage, and then she started dating this other person, and then she eventually left me for him one day out of the blue.
I'm sorry.
But, at the time, I thought there was a silver lining, because one of my first thoughts was, oh, now I can cross-dress all the time, because, previously I only really did it when she was out of town or out of the house. I didn't cross-dress when she was in the house, because I could tell that she was disgusted and kind of icked out by me cross-dressing, and for good reason. It's very fetishistic, and so that started this period of I started cross-dressing more and more and more, and every single day. And then at the time I was seeing a therapist, and this is in 2015, the trans tipping point. Caitlyn Jenner was in the news. And
how old were you roughly at this time?
I was 28.
Okay. So you were quite, not super late. I went from my experience when I was around a similar age, actually. So it's not really what you would, a lot of people look at kind of 40s and 50s sort of time. It's not super, you were still quite young.
Yeah, that was sort of the stereotype of, the AGPs is that, they're like you said, they're transitioning when they're in their 40s and 50s and, later in life. But I was kind of on the cusp. So I wasn't expressing a strong cross-sex identity and, hating my genitals since I was a child, and, or showing extremely effeminate behavior. Oh, and I also should mention, as a young child, I wasn't overly effeminate in any genuine sense. I was a normal rough and tumble boy, interested in masculine hobbies, sports, and, playing outside and rough and tumble stuff like that. I was just a regular boy, but, I was, a little bit sensitive, but not really that much. And
do you think that it's something that's innate that you have from birth and you're born with, or do you think it's something that comes from environment? Because I know the Blanchard theory says that it's something that is innate, but I'm not sure environmental
Right.
factors seem to do play a role in some way. I mean, what's your take on that?
My personal opinion on this is that there is at least some innate component, but I do think that, the concept of innateness is itself can be, difficult to nail down because every single, quote unquote, innate trait about ourselves, even things that are very clear, like our eye color or, our height and stuff like this, like, you have a genetic coding for your height from your parents, but at the same time, if you grow up in an impoverished like nutrition environment, you're not going to reach your full potential. So all nature only manifests through the exposure to the right environmental conditions. So even though I do think there's suggestive evidence that AGP runs in families and also it manifests at a young age in a wide variety of different cultures, I definitely think that the environment, particularly pornography, can, escalate and trigger and kind of like, make it way more intense. And particularly, whereas you might be able to compartmentalize it or keep it suppressed to some extent, the environmental stimulus of, transgender ideology and transgender culture, um, because after my wife left me and I was cross dressing and all this stuff, I never really had, I never thought, oh, I'm trans, or maybe I'm trans, or maybe I want to transition. I was just like, I was just a cross dresser. But then my therapist suggested I watch this interview with Bruce Jenner on with Diane Sawyer. I think it was like 2020. It was like 2015 trans tipping point, and he talked about how he had this like lifelong history of like, secretive, cross-dressing. It's like, oh, that's me. This is the most famous trans woman in the world, and he has a life history exactly like me. So maybe I can be a trans woman. Maybe I'm a trans woman. And then I started going on Reddit and I started asking questions about like, whether having a lifelong history of fetishistic cross-dressing kind of, invalidated the possibility that I could be a trans woman. And basically every single person on that site on Reddit said that no, that's not only does it invalidate you as a trans woman, it's normal. It is the normal experience of trans women to have this phase where it's a fetish. That is the normal experience for the vast majority of trans women. But I know I just said there's like I think there's an innate component, but I'm starting to warm up to the hypothesis that for some people it can be completely environmentally induced through pornography exposure.
I think, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that the environmental. I also do think there's something to be said about social kind of social contagion thing. I do think there's something to that, and I also feel like maybe there's a. It's morbid to say, but maybe there's something to a societal collapse version too. Because if you look at throughout history, a lot of cultures that are towards the end of their run, this tends to pop up a lot more. Usually with just males, but if you look at ancient Greece, the gender roles kind of switched towards the end. Ancient Rome, the gender roles switched towards the end. So I don't know, in the sense that they changed, not in the sense they switched entirely. But so I don't know if there's something to be said of if we're in a society where we almost have too much abundance and people don't have stuff to occupy themselves with.
Right. Well, think about the modern cohort of AGPs that are transitioning right now in our contemporary society. Often they are, what you might call the incel phenotype, or the incel stereotype, where these are young men, usually autistic, intelligent, sensitive, but also socially awkward, and not really getting a lot of success dating women or finding success dating women. And so they kind of retreat to these online communities, and they're into like anime, and they start getting involved in these online communities and stuff. And within this online trans culture, there's so much pornography, there's so much explicit fetishistic kinks, like the fetishizing of femboys, the sissy kink phenomenon, which is like a massive phenomenon. Like if you go into Reddit right now and you type in sissy, you will literally find like hundreds of subreddits dedicated to sissy kink, and with like millions and millions of like subscribers. So the sort of pornified side of trans Reddit is actually larger in terms of membership than the the safe for work side of trans Reddit, because this is a massive thing and there's definitely a pipeline. I've done a lot of videos on my channel, documenting how, if you go into some of these sissy subreddits and you type in things like hormones or trans, you'll see people being like, people who first start off with the sissy kink and then they start developing an interest in taking hormones, and part of it is because the hormones and the transition pathway, the modern medical transsexual transition pathway that we've offered these people through the medical industry, has itself become fetishized. So there's hypnotic videos about the fetishization of going on hormones. There's like videos out there like estrogen brainwash, brainwash yourself to like take estrogen, and it's seen as a form of emasculation. It's like the ultimate emasculation to go on hormones. And so, and then and then the paraphilic escalation, where you indulge in the paraphilia and then you sort of get a desire to do more and more and more, and it has a sort of addictive component. And I think as that escalates process.
If you don't mind me jumping in, was that your experience with it, going through those kind of things, or did you? Because you said you started with Bruce Jenner. That sounds like a relatively benign way of starting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's it's like a it's like a chicken and the egg thing, because there was definitely a sense in which I was initially just wanting to like cross dress all the time, because like I said, I was at home living by myself. It was like I was for the first time in like years, I had the opportunity to like cross dress in like my own apartment, all the time. But as you start wearing women's clothing every day inside of your house, it escalates to the point where now you want to go to the grocery store wearing a dress. You want to go to the bank. You want to, go out and socialize, and like, meet up with people, as a cross dresser.
But to jump in quickly, that with that sort of stuff, the perception of that, I guess, from a lot of gender critical people is that you're walking around with like constantly aroused all the time. Is that really what it is, or is it more so like when you say fetishistic, it puts forward the idea that this is always a turn on? Is it something that the idea of it, and then when you're actually doing it, like how does that play out in reality?
Yes and no. I mean, I think there's nuance here, because there definitely are, so paraphilia is cluster. AGP is a paraphilia, and but it often clusters with other things like exhibitionism. So there are some AGPs who might explicitly get a kink, or a like kick out of what we taking it outside, because there's like a rush of like, oh, maybe I'm going to get discovered, or people are, and so that's part of like the kink, is like that exhibitionist flavor. But in my own particular case, like my desire to sort of like take it from the bedroom into like the broader world, the broader social world, was not necessarily from an exhibitionist kink, because what happens often is, like, let's say you have a fetish for wearing panties, and you wear panties once, you get really aroused. But then if you wear panties like every day for like 3 months, at the end of those 3 months, you're probably not going to put them on and experience the arousal that you experience when you first get to them, because just like any addictive thing, you get habituated to the stimulus. Like you sort of, you have the same stimulus, but you're sort of habituated to it. You build up a tolerance to it, and it doesn't do anything for you anymore. It becomes normalized. And so that's what happened to me, where, because I was cross dressing literally every single day, all day long in my home, like it kind of lost that like explicit erotic, where it's like, I put on the clothing and like, I get aroused. That didn't happen. But that's not to say that underlying the motivation, that it's not sexual. It's ultimately a sexual motivation, even if it's not like connected to explicitly getting a boner.
Yeah. So when you say that, I mean, can you explore that a bit more? The idea that it's sexually motivated, even though it's not, because I guess for women, the hard thing to understand is the idea that something can be sexually motivated without being about sex, if that makes sense. So
Right.
what do you mean by that? As like to deconstruct that kind of further, what do you actually mean by the idea that it's sexually motivated without being aroused all the time?
Right. Well, just to give an example, suppose you are a heterosexual man and you're in a romantic relationship with a woman, and you're walking down the street and you're holding hands with her. Like that hand holding behavior, you're not experiencing explicit arousal. You don't have a boner while you're holding her hands. But ultimately, at a sort of evolutionary level, that behavior derives from a sexual impulse because that's part of courtship behavior. Courtship behavior has its ultimate psychological motivations from our sex drive, our living, like we are designed by the creator to have a impulse towards procreation, and so or towards sexual union, and so that drives us to engage in these courtship behaviors. So that's kind of what I mean is like, it's ultimately driving from the sex drive, even if like in the particular moment you're not experiencing arousal. And this is what AGPs often say as a sort of, trying to debunk the theory of autogynephilia. They'll say like, well, once I got on hormones and once I transitioned, it no longer felt fetishistic. So therefore it must be an expression of my true inner gender soul, my true innate gender identity that I've been repressing all these years. When just because the sexual eroticism transforms into something that feels more idealized or romantic or emotional, it does not mean that, you know, Dr. Blanchard was wrong, that ultimately the trans identity and the gender dysphoria and all this gender confusion does not arise from a distortion of normal sexuality, which is what it is as a paraphilia. It's like you take the mechanisms of heterosexual drive, and then there's something broken in that process that causes the normal sexual orientation towards other people, towards women, and it kind of turns it inwards to yourself in this selfish way, where it's kind of like it's not properly oriented towards what should be the object of your attraction, which is a woman.
And so, in that sense, would you describe it? Because a lot of people describe it as kind of wanting to own or possess being a woman. But would you? I guess the way you just described it would say you would describe it more such as be owning yourself as a woman, rather than it's not. So it's not an outward affection at all. It's a totally inward focused thing.
Right. I think one of the best ways to understand the phenomenon, and this is commonly reported amongst trans identified males, is they'll say like, the thing that is the universal experience among these trans identified males is that they have a attraction to women, or let's say they like see a beautiful woman. They're like, they're attracted to her. They think she's beautiful. They're staring at her, and like, in awe of her beauty and femininity. But at the same time as they're desiring her, they're also envious of her, and they wish, it's like I wish I could look like that. Like I wish I could have those breasts. I wish I could have, a vagina. I wish I could have soft skin and long hair and not be so masculine looking. So it's this sort of there's this great movie by the indie filmmaker, also a transsexual male, Amy, who did this movie called Envy Desire, and really captured that thing. And then the other sort of wrinkle in all this is that, so that sort of model where you have a desire towards your object of attraction, and then you have an envy of it that causes you want to embody that thing for yourself, is there's a subset or a subspecies of autogynephilia, where essentially your object of attraction is attraction to transsexual um, males. So like, a male who's gone through the process, the chick with the dick, the she-male.
Yeah.
So you have a fetish for the she-male, but then you're envious of the she-male and you want to be the she-male. So it's like, and this explains why not all autogynephiles want to, get rid of their penis because they like the idea of being a she-male. That's part of
And
the erotic appeal.
in the Blanchard theory, there's the second component, which he talks about the homosexual one. And in that, he says it's to do with societal, more or less to do with societal pressures or fitting in because they want to be with a man. That I find hard to reconcile with the other side of the theory because it says that one side of the theory says that it's basically innate, and the other side of the theory says that it's to do with societal pressures. So how do you reconcile those two bits being part of the same
Right.
two component theory?
So I did this one video on my channel called The Social Construction of the Homosexual Transsexual, because essentially the underlying basic phenotype of the homosexual transsexual is a effeminate homosexual. So a man who has, an innate attraction towards men, has always ever been attracted to men, has never expressed any attraction whatsoever to women, and that shows up from a young age. And then because of that, that phenotype of people like that, often they're highly effeminate, or they're, they sort of are naturally feminine. They can't help it. They can't hide it. Whereas the AGP child can hide their femininity. Their femininity only comes out in these kind of private contexts or in certain situations. Like, they'll play female video game characters, and that's like their only manifestation of their femininity. Whereas like these young effeminate homosexuals, like, everyone can tell that they're feminine boys. They just actually manifest like that. So that's the phenotype. However, in other countries and other cultures, like in Samoa with the Fa'afafina, which is a term that's used to describe the same thing, feminine men. In that culture, there is this researcher who worked with the Fa'afafina for 20 years doing extensive in-depth interviews. And one of the questions he would ask them is like, do you have any sort of cross-sex identity or any desire to medicalize or take hormones? And like in all his years, like pretty much none of those homosexuals had a desire to go down a transsexual pathway. Like they were aware of that as an option, but they had no interest in it because there was a social role carved out for the Fa'afafina in society where everyone, understood that like, hey, this is a particular type of man. This is a feminine man. We have a special social category for understanding them and helping them integrate that into life, and so that they can live a purposeful, meaningful life. Whereas in the West, we've constructed this narrative of transsexualism such that if you start manifesting the same effeminacy in childhood, you get pushed down this gender affirming narrative, which says that because you're expressing this cross-sex identity or this effeminacy, we're going to take you to a gender clinic and have psychiatrists and medical experts suggest that we need to castrate the child, and all this stuff. And so like we kind of like socially constructed the transsexual identity as an inevitable a pathway for anyone who shows any kind of cross-sex nonconformity. Whereas like in the research of Ken Zucker, he showed that for most of these effeminate homosexual boys, if you just do watchful waiting, don't intervene medically, watchful waiting, they go through puberty, like 80 to 90% of them desist in their cross-sex delusions. Yeah. And they just re-identify with their natal sex, and they learn to just grow up and be comfortable in the male gender role. Yeah. Whereas like for a small percentage, they persist in their delusion that they are girls, and so that may require psychiatric intervention.
But I still don't understand fully how you can reconcile those 2 points of view with the theory. So I occupy quite a functional mindset in this sort of stuff, so I find it quite hard to understand how one of them can be an innate thing and the other one can be based on societal pressures. It feels to me like they have to have some sort of an overlap to be, otherwise the validity between them seems to not be there without some sort of an overlap.
From what I've understood, I mean, and I'll just preface this by saying I'm not a gay man, so I don't fully understand this psychology. But from what I've understood, the core drive is that these are men who want to be in relationships with men,
Mm.
and they are effeminate. And in modern Western gay culture, there's this like mask for mask phenomenon where, like, because the gay man is usually attracted to masculine men. That is their object of attraction. So a lot of gay men are attracted to straight men because straight men embody that masculine ideal. Well, straight men don't want to have sex with a effeminate gay man.
Yeah.
So they think that because they're not having success in gay culture as an effeminate bottom, they think that, well, if in order to have a successful dating life with my object of attraction, straight men, what if I, transition, turn into a woman, and like, and like then I can like, date the men that I'm attracted to, which is the straight man. And so that's part of what I think Blanchard meant by social pressures, is the social pressure to find love and happiness and dating and romantic success in the gay world. And from and there's this gay man, Jack Jewell. I'm not sure if you're
Yeah,
familiar.
I've been on his podcast. Jack's pretty cool.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
He recently interviewed someone like a feminine gay man
Joseph.
who, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, and I think those are the narratives we need, is like, hey, you know, you can find, love and happiness, outside of this paradigm of transsexualism. And,
100%.
but I think there's a lot of, pessimism and skepticism within, from these feminine gay men. There's no way I can ever find someone who would love me as a feminine gay man, because most gays are, super into like masculinity, and they don't want to date like a feminine boy.
Yeah. So sorry. To skip back, I wanted to kind of just explore that because how it relates to AGP. But going back to AGP and kind of that side of things. So for it's more of an internal thing because I personally I understand. So what I would say is when I was thinking of transitioning, I definitely had what people would categorize as AGP thoughts, but I didn't have them in a sense of growing up. What I would categorize my dysphoria as is more of a sense of not wanting to be me. So I didn't necessarily have the same thoughts growing up as a lot of AGP males describe. I actually describe what I went through as more of kind of DID episode now, or like I probably always had DID as my therapist puts it. So I find this is where I get confused by it is if one wants to transition, and this is like the very critical thinking approach to it, I guess. It's like if one wants to transition and they're imagining themselves in a sexual scenario, by default, would they not always imagine themselves as a girl, therefore always AGP? That's where I get a logical loop of it.
And I
When I
want
said
to,
that, sorry, just now you said it, but yes, we're good.
okay, good. I was just a little paranoid for a second. But so this idea of like, a societal issue, like, ancient Greece or Rome or whatever, I think there is something to that with the modern culture, because in your experience, it sounds like you're saying you didn't have that same kind of like paraphilic syndrome manifest at a young age, which is what you do hear from a lot of AGP stories. But I think there's a newer phenomenon that's happening in our modern culture that is connected to young men finding difficulty living up to the pressures of masculinity and the pressures of being successful as a masculine man, because our culture has kind of glamorized this idea that, you need to be like 6 foot tall, six figures, 6-inch dick, this masculine alpha dominant man. And if you're not an alpha, you're a beta.
Yeah.
If you're beta, you're a loser, you're an incel. And so I think, and also in conjunction with our feminist messaging in our society, that masculinity is inherently toxic because it's an outgrowth of, systemic patriarchy. So they'll say like, cis white straight men are the ultimate oppressors in society. And a lot of these young men, very sensitive, they're feminist allies, and they don't want to associate that. And another thing is like these young men are often feel like, I'm not like other men. I don't relate to blue collar men. I don't relate to the jocks. I don't relate to macho gym bro meatheads. I'm a sensitive boy. And so because of that, I think, and then so I think that dissatisfaction with the male gender role in our society and the kind of expectations put onto men as like, this kind of paradigm of what it means to be a successful man. I think that alone can drive people down, this pathway. And I think that can start to induce envy of women, which is essentially the autogynephilic phenomenon of like, you're attracted to women, but you're envy of them. So that envy can maybe come from that innate paraphilic fetish, which is what I had, but like maybe that envy can arise from these more social forces that can then cause, that kind of autogynephilic envy where you sort of, you are attracted to women, but you want to be a woman. But you want to be a woman not because you have a fetish, but because your dissatisfaction with being male. So that's kind of like my, 2 cents,
That makes
back
sense.
of the envelope.
Would you say? I mean, I think it's interesting because I think you have a point of view that's valid because of someone who has been through it. So you think the idea that there is because with women transitioning, there is very much put forward the idea that there's a social contagion. Do you think that that's it feels to me just from what I've seen that it feels quite obvious that there is something more going on in that sense. Like I understand what you're saying. That makes a lot of sense what you're saying about the idea that it kind of ties into AGP in that way. But like kind of driven into that by the societal pressures. I mean, do you think that that's a valid kind of way of looking at it?
What the idea that there's like a social contagion for
Yeah.
males and not just for females?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
100%. Yes, absolutely. And it's driven by these online Reddit cultures and these Discord cultures. So there's all these like Discord servers, so all these, young men, and there's this phenomenon called pink pilling and like egg culture, cracking eggs and like, encouraging transition and like, and there's sort of and like in egg culture, so there's this subreddit called Egg in Real Life. It's got hundreds of
I got
thousands
pulled
of
into that one. Uh,
yeah. So you know exactly what I'm talking about, where these young men are sharing these anecdotes and stories about like, how they don't fit into the gender role, looking for clues that they're really trans, and some things that are perfectly innocuous for young men to feel in our culture that devalues men and doesn't put any positivity on being male. And it's hard for these young men to find any positive conception of being a man. Like they see it as just a toxic thing. Like, why would you ever want to be a man? Men are gross, men are jerks, men are toxic, men are oppressors. Why would you want to be a man in our society? And so they start looking for these signs like, oh, I like to play female video game characters, or like, oh, I whatever, all these little
Yeah.
things. Like,
Well, some of them it gets to the level of silliness. Like some of them were like, "Oh, you liked an orange rather than an apple today. Well, then you must be trans." Like it gets to that sort of level on that subreddit.
right,
Yeah.
right. It's like a sort of, auguring, it's like spilling the guts of an animal to predict, some divination or whatever. It's like it's a total kind of like, seeing faces in the clouds essentially. And so yeah, and I think and then there's this other completely destructive idea that comes out of gender ideology, which is that if you think you're trans or you suspect you're trans, then you are trans, because they'll say like cis people don't have these thoughts.
Mm.
If you're not trans, you don't get obsessed with these types of thoughts, which I think is totally false. I definitely think it's possible for people who are not destined to go down a transition pathway or not destined to identify as trans or to develop a strong cross-sex identity, it's very possible for them to have these sorts of obsessive thoughts about gender because our culture is obsessed with gender identity.
And
And
pretty
they're
much every cartoon I can think of as a kid has a gender swap episode. It's a relatively normal idea to think of what if, like most
right.
people have thought of that at one point, male or female.
Right. Like I grew up watching this little cartoon called Possible Possum, and there was like an episode where this owl cross dresses, and it's like burned into my memory.
Mm.
I remember being super fascinated by that, or fascinated by like that scene in Ace Ventura, or Bugs Bunny was always cross dressing, or all these things. So yeah, you're right. Like cross dressing is like a universal. But in the modern culture, it's not just like, like when I was growing up, it was like just little bits and pieces of culture here and there of like gender bending. But like now it's like you can't, throw a rock 10 feet without, landing on some, trans
Yeah.
person who's being glorified in the media or in a TV commercial or on social media or.
Someone I met with who was a female thinking of transitioning to male, she said that I don't want to think about it, but it's everywhere. I get on the train and there's pictures of mastectomy stuff. I get on the like everywhere I look. I open a magazine and it's there. It's just
Right.
It's like it's
Right.
daring you almost to do it.
Right. And furthermore, if you are left of center politically, and you start, engaging in, for example, TikTok, if you make your TikTok left of center politically in our modern culture, your algorithm is almost certainly going to expose you to, transsexualism as a concept, because that is a major pillar of the modern, democratic or left of center, a political ideology, is this sort of like centrality of trans people. And so even though they're like a relatively small percentage of the population, there's an over representation in the culture and glorification. And then you start, or let's say you're like a young man and you like Minecraft. So you start following this popular Minecraft YouTuber, Fenster, who's a trans-identified male, or what was a femboy. And then you start going on his Twitter because you want to follow him. Well, what is he posting on his Twitter? His like OnlyFans content and like softcore pornography. So it's like, and that triggers that sort of like fetishistic obsession with transsexualism. And so I think a lot of this stuff can definitely be induced, and like even if there is like some innate predisposition that like you need that predisposition to be like attracted to go down this pathway, like let's say there's like 1,000 men in a population that have that predisposition, like 40 years ago, only like a small handful of like that 1,000 men would have been, triggered by environmental stimuli to
And
go down
wealthy
that.
enough as well, or well off enough in a sense.
Yeah.
Because you have to.
Yeah.
It is something you have to be relatively comfortable, which a lot of people talk about being poor, but everyone is pretty comfortable in the West, relatively speaking.
Right. And furthermore, 40 years ago, you would have had to go through a gatekeeping system, which was relatively rigorous in order to get access to hormones and surgery. Whereas now there's so many guides out there. You can order hormones off the internet, or you can just go to Planned Parenthood for a 30-minute informed consent session and get hormones prescribed same day. So it is so much easier to transition than it ever was. And so even if there is a disposition, like we have made it possible. So we're triggering that latent disposition and unlocking it and then escalating it due to these cultural forces. So I really do think there is a social contagion, and that's not incompatible with there being a seed of disposition that is like required. Just one last thought. One of the things is like a candidate for what is an innate condition that could predispose you to developing these these fantasies is autism, actually. So if you are autistic, there's speculation about what's the mechanism here, but autism is often thought to involve, differences or deficiencies in self-processing, which, that's kind of what autogynephilia is. It's a deficiency in how you relate to your own self.
Okay, that makes sense. And just to go back quickly, you said in your childhood that you had you said something about Saturn and interests in that. How would you categorize kind of that as part of it before it was like an innately sexual thing?
In terms of like
Like you said,
the
when you
like
were
like, like
yeah,
the nylons and
yeah,
stockings.
yeah.
Well, in my interview with Dr. Blanchard, I asked him about this, and his speculation was that the nylons, when you put them on, they simulate smooth um, texture, which is sort of similar to the skin of a female.
Hmm.
So, like, that's a sort of like the attraction, because there's this famous thing is like, you know, everyone acknowledges that AGPs kind of internalize an attraction to very stereotypically feminine things like stockings and high heels and garter belts and stuff like this, but like that's not natural. Like like 10,000 years ago there was no such thing as like stockings and garter belts, so it's like how could this be innate?
Hmm.
Well, but Blanchard once said that like if there was a society where all the men dressed exactly the same, but the men wore 4 buttons and the women wore 5 buttons, the AGPs would want to wear that fifth button and
Okay,
they'd fetishize that.
okay.
So it's like and the other hypothesis I've heard is like as young boys, you're toddlers, you're, around your mother's ankles. And back then, women used to wear stockings to like church and stuff. And so you're crawling around on the ground and you like grab your hold of your mother's leg and you sort of get that sensory tactile thing. So there might be, I've heard some people speculate about that it has to do with like
So almost like an
essentially,
Ephesus syndrome in a sort of way, or Ephesus complex, with the Freudian concept of being in love with like one's mother. It sounds similar to
yes.
that in a concept.
I, 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 I think people are too quick to dismiss Freud as being, never having gotten any insight into anything
Oh no, I
whatsoever.
think you definitely
But
got a lot right. I just no,
yeah,
I actually more so. I think there's something to that. A whole
right.
idea
Yeah,
of
no, I agree.
yeah,
I think the Freudian analysis is relevant and useful, and
yeah. I think well, that's what I mean. The way you describe that would be like a relationship, almost like it's a relationship to how you think about your mother, and then because obviously she's the first woman that you would meet, so the relation, like you said, about touching the stockings and stuff, is that not a similar in concept or idea?
right. There's also a possibility that it's connected to sensory processing because and this is common among autistics where they have sensory issues with like the texture of clothing. Even though I'm not autistic, like to the best of my knowledge, having done lots of questionnaires, on this, I've always I don't think I am, but
Mhm,
as a young child, I really did not like scratchy clothing.
mhm.
I had to always cut off the tags on my shirt, or like the shirt had to be the right texture, otherwise it'd drive me crazy. And so the stockings are kind of, and also women's clothing in general are more silky and soft, and so I was always drawn to that. And like even today, if I'm going shopping for like, a shirt, the first thing I do is I touch the fabric to make sure it's soft enough for my liking.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's pretty common among, autistics. And so, yeah, I
I
think
used to
there's
be, to be fair, that's exactly the same as me. I used to be very, very funny about the clothes that I'd wear.
yeah.
Um, yeah. Oh no, and so okay, so the question I wanted to ask is after you went through all this, and then what was the point that you decided not to detransition and then kind of reclaim your manhood?
Right. So initially, it was motivated by this epiphany I had one day where, I kind of came to this realization that I wanted to prioritize my health. And I had been on hormones at for 8 years at this point, and I hadn't had an orchiectomy, so I still had my testicles. And because of that, I was taking a anti-testosterone blocker called spironolactone, which has a whole host of negative side effects. And so my doctors was always pushing me, when are you going to get the orchiectomy? Because you can't stay on this testosterone blocker for the rest of your life. So you need the orchiectomy medically. And there's something in the back of my mind that just was resistant to that. Even though my doctors have been kind of pressuring me to get it for like years at that point, I kind of always resisted it for whatever reason. I like never quite set aside the money to save up to pay the out of pocket cost or the co-insurance on the orchids. It's like, it's a few $1,000s or whatever. I just never saved up for that surgery. And so I kind of had an epiphany one day that's like, I don't want to be a medical patient for the rest of my life. Because I had to routinely go in and get blood work all the time to monitor my hormone levels, particularly because of the hormones and also having a history of smoking. I actually had a pulmonary embolism about like 3 years prior to my detransition. And also I developed something called pancreatitis due to elevated triglycerides, which is also due to taking the estrogen. Particularly the oral form of estrogen is particularly dangerous. And so, I switched to the patches after that, but I was like going to the doctor all the time, getting blood work. It's like, do I really want to have to go to the pharmacy and get blood work to control my, endocrine levels for the rest of my life? Do I really want to be a lifelong medical patient? And I came to the realization that like, it's better to be natural. And so I just kind of like out of the blue, a sudden epiphany, decided to go off the hormones. And then I didn't initially want to socially detransition, but very quickly after that, the social detransition followed. And at the time, I was with my second wife, and she started watching all this sort of gender critical
So you were
stuff.
with her while you were still trans, or?
We met when I was trans. I met my second wife when I was like 5 years into my transition.
So she must have been completely fine with it then.
Yeah, she was very much, fine with me being trans. And so yeah, because we married under Rachel, like that, like that was my legal name at the time. So we married like legally, and like legally on the whatever in the eyes of the state, it's because I had like changed my sex marker on my driver's license. Like, we were married as like two females,
Okay.
in
Yeah.
fiction, um but yeah, so she kind of had her own de-wokening. She was very woke, very LGBT, pro trans, all this stuff, just like pretty much every like, good leftist.
Yeah.
And but she started watching, Gender a Wider Lens podcast, started watching Benjamin Boyce, started watching detransitional narratives. And I kind of like was resistant to this because at the, my whole trans identity, I was a hardcore trans activist.
Okay.
I wrote a book defending trans ideology that got published by a reputable, LGBT friendly publishing imprint. So I was like a well-known trans activist
Do you
who
still at least get like royalties from that?
technically,
Yeah.
yes, even though I don't think it's selling.
All right. Well,
I don't think it's selling any copies anymore. But technically, if someone were to buy it,
yeah.
I would get royalties, which is sort of funny.
Yeah.
And I had this Medium blog, this trans philosopher blog. I was actually debating like gender critical people and all this stuff. And to my regret, I pushed a lot of gender ideology. So when my second wife started getting into this gender critical stuff, I was resistant, but I started listening. And as I started listening to these detransition narratives, it just sort of like the scales fell off my eyes, and I started to see the problems with gender identity ideology. And from there, I started my YouTube channel. I started getting involved in this sort of activism. I got on Twitter, and yeah, the rest is history, basically.
Okay. And then since you fully detransitioned, how are you kind of reclaiming yourself as a man? How are you reclaiming your manhood?
Well, when I first detransitioned, I sort of like, really wanted to man up, and I wanted to be as masculine as possible because my pendulum swung to wanting to be super masculine. And so I kind of swore off cross dressing because I still had all my Rachel clothes. I had this whole wardrobe of like women's clothing, and that worked for a while. As far as like, I didn't really have an interest in cross dressing anymore. And throughout my whole transition, the whole fetishistic masturbation stuff fell away, and so I didn't really have anything like that. I didn't have any kind of sissy kinks or anything when I was like trans. But then, like, a few months into my detransition process, like, the testosterone really activated my libido, which caused my paraphilic desire to ramp up, and I started becoming, you know, the like fetishistic side of my AGP started like re-emerging. And so like I eventually started getting these like, temptations and, to like indulge my paraphilia and then I started developing like, more kinky sissy kink stuff. Like, and so I started like, dabbling in cross dressing again. And then like, long story short, like I've recently come into a religious conviction, which I think is common amongst detransitioners. And, on my newfound religious conviction, it is sort of, I like recently wrote a Substack essay about this, about how Catholicism has helped me solve my autogynephilia problem, because within the self-aware AGP community of people who, talk about this, there's this common idea of like, repression is psychologically unhealthy. So if you never indulge your paraphilia, if you never sort of have these, crossy sessions or, masturbation sessions or whatever, if you, let's say you're just going to torture yourself psychologically. So you need some outlet for your paraphilia. Otherwise, you're going to just psychologically torture yourself. And I bought that for a long time. So for many, many months in my detransition journey, I, had an integration strategy where like, I kind of occasionally cross dress and, sometimes I would like cross dress on like my YouTube channel, or and I had this, private, kink life, sissy kink and all this stuff. And I got into chastity kink and all this stuff. And, so that was like my outlet to, to prevent that, torture of like trying to repress it.
Yeah.
I eventually came to the realization that this integration strategy, this indulgence in the kink, it developed into an addictive pattern such that I started experiencing an escalation phenomenon again. And so I came to the conviction of my moral conscience that it was wrong, that I was like harming myself, that I was engaged in self-destructive paraphilic sexual addiction. It was essentially like a sex addiction. And because I was like, engaging in all this degenerate behavior, and it's just self-destructive, and it was preventing me from having healthy heterosexual, dating and sex life. And it was sort of conflicting with like, because at this time, like at this point, like, I had initiated divorce proceedings against my second wife, for reasons that are partly related to the detransition, but are not fully related to the detransition. But I don't really like to go into it,
No,
because
that's free,
for the sake of her privacy and my privacy, I don't really try and talk about those reasons. But I initiated divorce, and I've been living on my own for quite some time. And so I started dating again, and I kind of realized that like trying to find a heterosexual woman or bisexual woman to, integrate this paraphilia into my life, in my dating life, was gonna be really hard, because it conflicts. The more I engaged in my AGP kinks, less sexual energy I had to pour into, my heterosexual relationships with women. And so I almost had to like pick and choose or compromise something. And then, recently I just had this total religious awakening that, God, called me out like in a strong, moral conscious, crisis. And, and this is also connected to a cannabis addiction, because, the cannabis addiction fueled the sort of like hedonistic pursuit of self pleasure. And I came to realize that that sort of like pursuit of sexual pleasure for its own sake in this kind of very hedonistic, paraphilic, addictive way was just self-destructive to my well-being, my flourishing. And I came to, long story short, I came to have religious convictions about the Catholic faith, and the Catholic faith teaches a very clear sexual ethic in regards to the fact that, masturbation itself is intrinsically disordered because it's not oriented towards the blueprint of, what our sexual organs are designed for, which is, the unitive procreative purpose of a penis going into a vagina and creating life, essentially. I just sort of realized that this autogynephilic paraphilia was intrinsically disordered. And once I accepted that even these healthy integration strategies are intrinsically disordered, it allowed me, the internal strength to make a commitment to not wanting to do that anymore, and to kind of like, reconnect with like my God-given maleness, which is a ontological reality.
Okay, so the steps you take, you think you think religion can help with, like, you think that's kind of the basis for which you would move on from there.
Yes, I do think religion is helpful insofar as you need to find a transcendental like purpose in living a chaste, sexually pure life. Because if you are of the modern materialistic, and I say materialist in this sort of like metaphysical sense, so that all that exists is matter, that there's no intrinsic purpose or meaning in the universe, we're all just atoms and cosmic dust or whatever, Carl Sagan's, we're all just star stuff, we're just dust, essentially. If you have that view, there's no intrinsic purpose or design to anything. And so we, on this view, you can develop a modern secular ethics where like, pursuing, your preferences, satisfying your preferences is going to be, um, the ultimate, purpose. So you kind of create your own meaning, your own purpose. And so if you don't have a transcendental conception of what is good and for human flourishing based on a more eternal blueprint for how we ought to live our lives, then it's going to be very easy to justify to yourself the continual indulgence in this sexual masturbation stuff, because you're saying to yourself like, well, I'm not hurting anyone. I'm consenting and I'm feeling pleasure and it feels good. So therefore, if it feels good, it must be conducive to my well-being. But it's like, so I do think having a more transcendental perspective on like how sexuality ought to be can help AGPs, resist this self-serving justification of like, yeah, just indulge it. It's no big deal. Like, it's not going to harm you because, you know, on the liberal secular framework, like harm is cashed out in terms of like the principle of freedom. Like if you freely consent to something, then it's okay. So if I freely consent to some super messed up BDSM scene, then like that's okay morally. Whereas like on the more Catholic position, some things are intrinsically wrong, regardless of like, our intentions or freedom or our consents. Like you can consent to something that's morally wrong on the Catholic view. So I do think having that more transcendental perspective on sexual ethics is like pretty much, in my opinion, the only thing that makes it possible to repress. And, I do want to say that I just preface this that like, this is a new thing for me. So it's like my cynics and skeptics are like, well, you're just in the honeymoon phase. You're just in this like, zeal, this religious zeal. And so give it 6 months, give it a year, give it 3 years, then you're, all this stuff is going to resurface. And I'm going to just like torture myself and it's all going to blow up in my face. I'm going to retransition. Like so many people have told me that, like,
Oh,
I'm
I've got that
destined to,
you're
yeah.
repressing or someone else, outside factors. The same stuff that you always get from people.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting. I mean, we're coming up to an hour, so I want to ask you the question I'm asking everyone is if you could tell something to your younger self, what would it be?
I would say, yeah, that's a good question, because my younger self was a hardcore atheist, and I doubt anything that I doubt anything that I tell myself now about like
Hey, I'm used to the
find
future.
I think if I went back to my earlier self and I said find Jesus, I'd be like, what are you talking about, dude? Like, you're like crazy.
That's what I mean. I guess
Um,
the question is like, how would you? Because most people have that experience where the younger self wouldn't listen to them at all. So how would you convince your younger self of without directly saying it? Because I guess that's the trick with all of this is, we
right.
have to find a way to communicate to people who are who haven't gone down that rabbit hole, who haven't experienced so many things. How we can communicate what's important.
Right. I think I would just say to my younger self, be more critical of the claims of gender identity ideology and recognize that it is an ideology that has certain philosophical presuppositions, and to, remain grounded in my male identity and that it's good to be male, and don't let anyone tell you that it's bad to be male. Learn to find positivity in your male identity, and just like don't and like value your health above all, because if you value your health above all, you're not going to sacrifice your health to pursue a sexual kink. You're just not. So it is only when you elevate your sexual hedonistic pleasure above the natural integrity of your physical body that would allow you to sacrifice your health in order to pursue that thing. But if health is an intrinsic value that's given to us as a gift from God, the body's a temple, then you're going to be less tempted to sacrifice the integrity of your body to pursue sexual pleasure. So, but like I said, I'd probably not listen to myself now.
It's difficult. Yeah, it's difficult. That's the question: is how do you get it? How do you actually get this message across to the people who
Yeah.
are thinking of doing it? Because people are so, I'm going forward. I'm doing this. It's hard
Right.
it's hard to stop people. I mean, I don't know. Other than what happened to me and the situation that was the crazy things that happened, I don't know if there was much that could have convinced me in that moment when I was going to do it.
Right. Right.
It's tricky.
I mean, I think that's why as a detransitioner, it's like I'm less tempted at all to retransition and do this stuff because I've already done that.
Mm.
Whereas if I hadn't gone down that pathway and already tried that, I probably would have been like, well, what if the grass is greener on the other side? Because a lot of these young men who have, unsatisfactory lives living in the male gender role or trying to live up to these expectations of what it means to be a successful man in our society, they sort of are always wondering, like, if the grass is greener, like, well, what if my life would be made better by transition? Because social media sells this narrative of like, find your true self and discover ultimate happiness. Look inside yourself, discover your authentic identity, and you'll be happy and you'll live happy ever after.
Yeah.
So,
Well, what do you think we can do for young men to make it easier? Like, or to make it to make them more happy with being a man?
right. Well, I mean, I'm committed now to saying that they need to get right with God.
No, fair,
Like,
that's fair. Yeah.
that is like my new worldview perspective from which I'm viewing how to handle these temptations to indulge in paraphilia. You have to have a conviction of the fact that it's intrinsically wrong. Otherwise, you're just going to relativize everything and and you're going to pursue pleasure. So I do think that, finding religion is, you know, is
Finding, so
eh,
you could expand that out, I guess, to saying finding purpose.
yes, finding a higher purpose, like, so particularly if you're married, because a lot of AGPs are in, serious committed relationships, find a higher transcendental purpose in staying true to that intrinsic design of the male female dynamic. Hold on to that, find purpose in that, find transcendental purpose in being a father and being a husband and living that self-giving role where like you're supposed to give yourself in a sacrificial way to your spouse, and you're not supposed to, you know, blow up your family and marriage in order to pursue your own hedonistic sexual pleasure. So like you need to find some higher purpose, which is what, you know, from the 12 steps, we know all addiction, you know, you need that conception of the higher power to realize that, you know, you need help. And so that you have to come to that conviction that this is wrong. And so that's kind of my newfound perspective. And